I found the village everyone had forgotten completely by accident, although later it seemed to me for a long time that there were no accidents in this story at all. I was driving along a road that did not exist on the map, or rather, it was marked by a thin gray line, as if someone had once drawn it in pencil and immediately regretted it. The asphalt ended suddenly, without warning, and the car rolled onto old concrete, cracked like dry earth. On both sides stretched a forest, dense, dark, almost without undergrowth, as if it had long ago unlearned how to let people in. The trees stood too close to the road, their branches scratching the sides of the car, and it felt as though the forest was slowly closing in behind me, erasing any trace of my presence. I did not know exactly where I was going. There was no destination and no route in the navigator, only a weak signal and a feeling that things would only get worse ahead. I did not want to turn back, not out of stubbornness, but because of a strange sensation, as if I had already crossed some invisible boundary beyond which different rules applied. The air became colder, quieter. Even the engine sounded different, muffled, as if it too did not want to disturb the peace of these places. After several kilometers, the forest began to thin. The trees retreated, revealing a wide, almost empty clearing, and there, in the distance, the first houses appeared. They stood unevenly, as if placed in haste or abandoned in a hurry. The roofs had collapsed, the windows were black, empty eye sockets, and the fences were crooked and half-rotten. I stopped the car and turned off the engine. The silence that fell over me was not just the absence of sound. It was dense, tangible, like fog in which one could drown. I stepped out of the car and took a few steps forward. Old grass mixed with last year's leaves crunched under my feet. No dogs, no chickens, no voices, nothing. Only the wind, and even it moved cautiously, uncertainly, like a guest who did not know whether he was allowed to stay. That was when I realized I had found a village everyone had forgotten. Not just abandoned, but truly forgotten, one whose memory had been erased even from lists and reports. The first house I approached was built of dark logs. Once they had been strong and even, but now they were dried out, covered with cracks and moss. The door hung on a single hinge and creaked softly when I touched it. Inside, it smelled of dampness, old wood, and something else, the smell of time, impossible to describe. In the room stood a table covered with a faded oilcloth, and on it lay an overturned mug. I caught myself thinking that the owner might have stepped out for just a minute and never returned. The thought was foolish, but for some reason it was very persistent. I went further, from room to room. On the wall hung a photograph, a man in a military tunic, a woman with a headscarf, and two children. They looked into the lens seriously, without smiles, the way people did when a photograph was an event rather than a habit. The frame was crooked, the glass cracked, but the faces remained. I suddenly felt a strange embarrassment, as if I had entered a place where I had not been invited. Outside, I noticed a well. It was almost intact, only the bucket was missing and the winch was jammed. The grass around it was trampled, as if people had only recently come here for water. I lowered my hand into the cold, damp air above the shaft and shuddered. It felt as though not only cold was rising from below, but someone else's breath. I walked along the street, if it could be called a street. It was more like a long clearing between houses, overgrown with grass and bushes. Here and there lay rusty buckets, broken sleds, old children's toys without eyes or arms. Every object was like a question with no one left to answer it. I tried to imagine how people had lived here, how they cleared snow in winter, how they waited for the mud to dry in spring, how in summer they sat on benches by their houses and talked about nothing and everything at once. In the center of the village stood a building larger than the others. Perhaps it had been a school or a community hall. The windows were taller, the porch wider. I climbed the steps, which bent under my weight, and looked inside. The spacious hall was empty, except for a few overturned benches and an old blackboard against the wall. Traces of chalk were still visible on it, numbers, letters, fragments of words. I ran my finger over them, and white dust remained on my skin. It seemed to me that echoes of voices were still preserved here. Not real ones, but imagined, yet so distinct that I almost heard children's laughter, a strict teacher's voice, footsteps on the wooden floor. I realized I had been standing there too long, as if waiting for someone to come in and ask what I was doing there. I went outside and sat down on the step. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in dull, cold colors. Shadows from the houses stretched and intertwined, as if trying to hide the village completely. I took out my phone, but there was no signal. Even the time on the screen seemed frozen, as if it did not work here either. I began to wonder why this village had been forgotten. Were there reasons, war, resettlement, an accident, or did everything happen gradually, unnoticed, as it so often does? First one family left, then another. The school closed because there was no one left to study. The shop closed because there was no one left to buy. The bus began to run less often, then stopped running altogether. And at some point, the last person closed the door and left, not knowing that he was the last. With these thoughts, I walked beyond the edge of the village. There began an old cemetery. Low crosses, many without names, some fallen over. The grass here was taller, and the air heavier. I walked slowly, reading the few inscriptions where the letters could still be made out. The dates stretched back decades, sometimes breaking off in the middle of the century. I realized that the village had not died suddenly, but slowly, generation after generation. Suddenly, I noticed a house that was different from the rest. It was smaller, but looked more well kept. The roof had not collapsed, the door was closed, the windows intact. My heart gave an unpleasant jolt. I came closer and heard a creak, not from the wind, but from footsteps. I froze. The door slowly opened, and an old woman appeared on the threshold. She was small, hunched, wearing a dark headscarf. Her face was wrinkled like old bark, but her eyes were alive and attentive. She looked at me without fear, rather with weariness, as if she had been waiting for someone for a long time but was not sure she would ever see them. She did not ask who I was or why I had come. She only said that no one had been here for a long time. Her voice was quiet, but steady. I did not know what to answer and simply told the truth, that I had found the village by accident. She nodded, as if she had known this in advance. We sat by her house in silence. Then she began to talk, not about herself, but about the village. About how noisy it used to be, how people gathered in the evenings, how they warmed themselves by stoves in winter, and worked from morning until night in summer. She spoke slowly, sometimes stopping, as if listening to something inside herself. I listened and understood that for her, this village was alive. Not as a place, but as a memory. She said she had not left because she could not. Her parents, her husband, her children were buried here. She saw no sense in starting life anew somewhere else, where no one knew her name. Better, she said, to be the last one here than the first somewhere else. The sun set, and it grew cold. She invited me to come inside, but I refused. It seemed to me that if I crossed that threshold, I would become part of this forgotten life and would not be able to leave. We said goodbye, and she closed the door just as slowly as she had opened it. I returned to the car at dusk. The village dissolved into darkness, as if it had never existed at all. I started the engine and drove away, trying not to look back. The road seemed shorter, but perhaps that was only a feeling. A lot of time has passed, but I still think about that village. I cannot find it on the map, cannot remember the exact turn after which it appeared. Sometimes it seems to me that if I tried to return, I would find nothing, no houses, no road, no forest. Only an empty place where memory once lived. That day I understood one simple thing: there are places that exist only as long as they are remembered. When memory fades, they remain physically, but disappear for real. And perhaps I was one of the last people to see that village not as ruins, but as a living place that still breathes, even if very quietly. Sometimes at night I dream of that road, the forest, and the houses with black windows. I step out of the car again and hear the silence wrapping around me. And every time I think that if you listen very carefully, you can hear the footsteps of those who once lived there and never truly managed to leave.